Hi, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and I'm keeping you updated with the big news across the world. This is a U turn by AstraZeneca, vaccine related clots. Why exactly have they done it? I'm not sure. But more importantly, the question is why did it happen in the first place? And what does it mean in terms of the science? Because what is the mechanism of these unusual blood clots that they're willing to compensate for? So, we're going to be covering today in this session the news story from GB channel about AstraZeneca admitting its COVID vaccine rare side effect. We're going to be covering vaccine induced immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia. That's the actual diagnosis, looking at what they're likely to limit the diagnosis to. And I'm, as usual, going to take you through some slides looking at the science around it. But as usual, before we start, the first thing to acknowledge is that yes, Humming Heroes is still number one, day number two. And believe me, we're facing stiff competition. So here we have on Amazon bestsellers today, you can see here Humming Heroes is still number one. But just behind us, number two, this was only about number 10 yesterday. They are now right on our tail. Deception by Rand Paul. And we are competing with the man himself. He's in number 9 position, Anthony Fauci. So, for those who are supporting us, we do appreciate what you're doing. We've held the number one spot so far, and we will hope that we continue to do it. So, thank you very much. Links are below if you want to get the Kindle version, soft cover, and we are developing a system for the hardcover, which you register for. Additionally, coming up in a few days' time, we will be having our next advanced COVID 360, the autoimmune response. This is a big one for me. This is really the focus of the research that I've been looking at from early 2020. And I'm tying it into section 4 of this 360 course. So if you want to join the recording, please do so at the link below. So, getting straight back to why in the world did AstraZeneca decide to do this at this point? Interesting. So, what it is that the GB News highlights this AstraZeneca admitting its COVID vaccine causes a rare side effect in an astonishing U turn. And they're highlighting here, this was published on the 30th of the 4th, just today. The pharmaceutical giant is currently facing a class action lawsuit over claims its widely distributed COVID vaccine led to deaths and serious injuries. And remarkably, they have admitted for the first time that its COVID vaccine does cause the side effect. This sorry, just got distracted there. So this is important to try and see if one can understand why did they do it at this point. Because when you look back at the history, and you look at what was happening here, is that in this is another story from the Mail Online, and it was a $1 billion pound battle for COVID justice. And this was looking at 90 British families left bereaved, and they were fighting for compensation to avoid financial ruin. And they insisted that they were not anti vax. The reason why this was important is that at that time they were fighting, so AstraZeneca was pushing back on this. And they believed that the claim on some of the cases could be worth up to 20 million in compensation, roughly 160 times more than the 120. So they were pushing back. And this was in May 2023. So this has been around for a while, but they did not accept liability at that point. And for some reason, they've decided to do it now. It's unclear what the reason is that changed their mind. But I'm here to look at the science because, as far as I'm concerned, is that even though this is acknowledged with AstraZeneca, the question is this related to the spike protein, wherever it comes from? That's really the question. Because if AstraZeneca can do it, does this also occur with the other types of vaccine. Certainly J&J, in terms of it seems to be a higher risk than the mRNAs. Here is exactly what it is. So this is from the American Society of Hematology, and they were looking here at vaccine-induced immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia. And say they updated that in 2022. And the key takeaways there is that in order for a diagnosis to be occurred, which is VITT, it must meet all five criteria. Okay, that's important. All five, not one, not three, not four. It must meet all five. One, they had to have a COVID vaccine, and they don't specify AstraZeneca, they just say any vaccine, 4 to 42 days prior to the symptom onset. It's interesting that they use the 42-day timeline. I understand that they anticipate that this is likely to occur within that time for a normal vaccine, but what about when it triggers autoimmunity? Any venous or arterial thrombus, usually cerebral in the brain, thrombocytopenia, which is a low platelet count, less than 150. This is important. Positive PF4, heparin-induced thrombocytopenic antibodies, and a markedly elevated D dimer, greater than 4 times the upper limit. And so those are the 5 criteria that I suspect that they're going to use. The reality is that from a legal point of view, what they will say is that if you are missing one of the criteria, you don't apply. That's where I think the problem is going to come. Now, let's look at a little bit more in terms of the symptoms around the vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia. Severe headache, visual changes, abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting, back pain. So, quite a number of things that can occur. What you have to note is down at the bottom, where they have highlighted here, is that to date, VITT appears far more likely following AstraZeneca and Johnson Johnson than Moderna, Pfizer mRNA vaccines. So they have acknowledged that it does occur, but just not as frequently. So that's an important point to highlight. So here is the issue. As I said, if you don't understand autoimmunity around COVID, nothing makes sense. This is why I'm encouraging people, please join in the course. Make sure you understand the science around things, and I'm going to take you through some of the steps. But when you understand autoimmunity, for one, if you understand autoimmunity, you would realize that some of the criteria that they're likely to use are going to be a problem. For one, 42 days is probably not enough time because autoimmune responses vary in terms of how long it can take for someone to get the problems. Certainly, they will get the cerebral and thrombosis, but sometimes, because it's a gradual process, even that thing can take a long time. What happens if somebody's platelet count is 155? They're not less than 150. Would they not count? And what if their autoantibodies were too low or had resolved? They will not get compensation either. What happens if their D dimer is only 3 times the upper normal of limit? This is where you realize that I suspect they have done this because they figure that they can limit the payout by focusing on this very tight group, because what they have then done is kind of like what happens when you watch some of these legal shows. If you acknowledge manslaughter, you don't get for murder. It's that kind of thing. So they are going for a very tight diagnosis that is relatively rare in terms of the criteria, and therefore one can minimize the payout. I don't know. But from a scientific point of view, my question is, what is the mechanism? So I'm going to take you through a few slides, and I'll try and explain to you what I think is the science around it. The first thing you have to start with, as usual, is this spike protein. Remember, this is the viral spike protein, about 25 of them on the surface of a virus. This is about what it looks like. And on top here is the ACE2 binding domain. Now, This spike protein is what occurs in infection. It's usually tied to the virus, not that it can't be free, but it's a little bit different when you consider that in the context of vaccination, this is free after you've given either the mRNA or the adenovirus vaccine, and it has made spike protein. So here is a problem that I think is absolutely remarkable when you actually think about it. When I speak of ACE2 autoimmunity, we started the research, that was all we were looking at, only to realize that there are a number of other proteins that also bind to the spike protein, including furin, neuropilin 1, DC sign, the estrogen receptor, heparin sulfate, CD147. This means potentially that every single one of these proteins that can bind to the spike protein could get caught up in an autoimmune response. So, depending on what kind of autoimmunity is triggered, would determine the symptoms that could occur. So this is very, very important. And so here you have again the image of all these proteins stuck to a spike protein. In reality, it will be one at a time. But the point being is that our argument was very simple. Once these proteins have been bound to a spike protein and the immune system then goes about trying to make antibodies, it can't differentiate the normal protein from the spike protein. So it will make antibodies to both. That's fundamentally the simplistic approach to autoimmunity. Slight difference with AstraZeneca versus Pfizer, and that's to do with the addition of proline, two proline amino acids in the receptor binding domain just to stabilize the spike protein. And it seems that this may have an impact as to how effectively it binds to some proteins. So maybe it doesn't bind as well to, say, ACE2. And so maybe this is why they have less cases of vaccine induced thrombocytopenia. So, again, just some simple science. This is a blood vessel here. These are the endothelial cells here. These are the red blood cells. This is fibrin that forms when you're making a clot. These little light blue star-like things are to represent activated platelets. And what happens, the platelets trigger everything, and the blood cells get tied up and they make a big clump and eventually form a blood clot. So this is the standard situation with regards to formation of a blood clot. But the part that is relevant when I'm talking about vaccine induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia is to do with the platelets. So, platelets, this is now an image of a platelet, and these are all the things that can activate a platelet. So, there are multiple receptors on the surface of the platelet, and almost any one of them can activate the platelet. And when the platelet is activated, they're very tiny, they're much smaller than a blood vessel, a blood cell. They then release a number of granules into the circulation that either aid or impede the clot forming mechanism. One of these is a protein called heparan sulfate. And there's a reason why I'm taking you on this journey towards this. Now, here is two critical things. So, one of the molecules that is released is actually platelet factor 4. Platelet factor 4 binds to heparan sulfate, and it has an impact on the ability of the blood to clot, because at the time when the blood is trying to clot, it doesn't want anything that will block it from occurring. And so heparan sulfate, very similar to heparin, is acting to thin blood down. And so it makes this molecule when they bind together. Okay? Now, what then happens, because heparan sulfate itself can bind to the spike protein. Now, I've just put it here. It doesn't mean it's exactly on this location of the spike protein. But you can see what I'm doing here, that suddenly now, if you had circulating spike protein or even bits of the spike protein that can bind the heparan sulfate, you then have the platelet factor 4 bound to this as well. This is where the problem occurs. because now you have a situation where the immune system can then start to target this complex and make antibodies against it. Now, this complex can also bind to the surface of the platelets and make immune complexes on the surface of it. And then that autoantibody response, because once the antibodies are attached to the platelet, it triggers the immune system to target this platelet and destroy it. It's kind of like it's equivalent to actually going in the water around sharks and putting blood around you. It just stimulates the sharks and they will come after you, even if you are not the one bleeding. And so the antibodies do a similar job of making the immune system hungry to destroy anything that have antibodies on it. And it's this autoantibody process that not only destroys some platelets, but also triggers some to make clots. And this is why you end up with the situation of uh, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia. So if you look carefully at the name, it's vaccine-induced immune thrombotic, making clots, thrombocytopenia, low platelet count. And the two things together, so you can have bleeding and clots occurring at the same time. This is part of the reason why it is such a dangerous condition to occur and why it's taken so seriously. So the main takeaway from this is, one, I'm glad that they're acknowledging it. That's a good start. But I'm concerned that people keep on saying it's rare. What is rare is having all five criteria being put together. But it's not rare for somebody to have an event within 42 days or longer of being vaccinated. It's not rare necessarily for somebody to have a cerebral thrombosis that's far more frequent than it was. It's not rare to have some abnormalities here or even the combination. What is rare is going to be having all of these fitting the criteria. But every single one of these is technically a disease and can cause significant harm to the population. These are big times, big challenges ahead of us. What we're seeing, though, is that finally there is a degree of acknowledgement about what the implications are. Now, I am not one of those people who says absolutely that you shouldn't vaccinate. I thought from the start that you target it. You target it to people who are high risk of severe disease and who have not had a prior infection. That was it. Now, if they had done that, even if you had some of these complications occurring, what you could find is that the benefit to the high risk outweighed the risk. That was fundamentally it. But the minute that it went political and financial, and they started to do this, even in the low risk cohort, I thought at the time it meant that their product had to be absolutely perfect. Because if a cohort didn't have a significant risk in the first place, and you have created a risk by giving them something for which they may not have needed, I can't help you there. And that's my advice even to people. There's still a lot of people who are very pro shouting from the rooftops. I'd advise them to be cautious. Just be balanced and just say that was some benefit, but it needed to be in the correct cohort as every aspect of medicine is. That's how it is across medicine. So, thank you. I hope that was valuable for you. And just a reminder again, if you haven't yet registered to try and support us to stay at number one on Amazon, please do so shortly. Let's see if we can win against the big teams that are out there trying to get to our number one position. Have a great evening, and we'll share more stuff with you soon.